Hello and welcome to our appliqué tutorial. In this short tutorial we're going to be showing you how to appliqué motifs such as a letter or a shape onto a fabric. This is a perfect way that you can use to decorate items, from bunting to bags. We're going to be showing you 3 different ways that you can actually sew around your motif and how to actually attach the motif onto the fabric with Bondaweb or a double-sided adhesive. So let's get started. I'm going to start by showing you how to use Bondaweb or a similar double-sided adhesive. Now, in terms of the equipment and materials that you will need to complete any appliqué, obviously you'll need your main fabric and also the fabric that you wish to use in your motif. I would recommend a pair of scissors, a pencil or a bit of chalk or something that you can draw your motif shape out with, and obviously the thread that you wish to use on either the sewing machine or by hand stitching. And Bondaweb or a double-sided adhesive if you wish to use it. Obviously you don't need to use it, but you will find that it will make the process slightly easier because everything is nicely stuck down and ready to take to the sewing machine or to sew by hand. Now, the other thing to point out is that you don't necessarily have to actually sew on top of this with the sewing machine or by hand. You're welcome to actually leave the motif stuck on by Bondaweb if you don't sew, and that's absolutely fine. You may find that the motif fabric will fray slightly, but if you're happy with that, then you can just go for it. So we're going to start by showing you how to use the Bondaweb or a similar double-sided adhesive. And I would recommend looking at the instructions that come with yours just in case it's slightly different to mine. Now what I'm going to do is I've got a template that I'm going to be working with, and I need to draw around this template on the smooth side of the Bondaweb. The Bondaweb has 2 sides when you take it off the roll. One side is smooth, the other is much more textured. So with the smooth side facing up, I'm going to position my template on. Doesn't matter where I place it. Position it on and draw around it with a pencil. One thing I want to point out here is that if you are working with letters, you will need to draw the letter onto the Bondaweb back to front. So you'll need to flip it over. And that's really important so that when you actually complete the stage, your letter is the right way facing up. So I've drawn around my templates. Now I'm going to iron this on to my motif colour fabric. Take your piece of Bondaweb or double-sided adhesive with your drawn motif, and you're going to position the rough side of the Bondaweb double-sided adhesive onto the wrong side of your fabric. So I've got the wrong side of my fabric facing up, the rough side of the Bondaweb is going onto that, and I've got the drawn template, so the pencil markings of the Bondaweb or double-sided adhesive are facing up as well. And we're going to simply iron that on to the fabric for about 5 seconds using dry heat. So no steam, just dry iron. And again, I would recommend that you double check your instructions if you're working with a different branded double-sided adhesive. Once you have ironed your Bondaweb or double-sided adhesive onto your fabric, you're simply going to cut out the motif around the drawing. So the drawn line that you created, you're going to cut it out. And again, as I mentioned earlier, if you're working with a letter, this should be back to front at present. And that goes for saying anything. It doesn't have to be a letter. Anything that has to be a certain way or in a certain direction, you will need to draw onto the Bondaweb back to front. And we're simply going to cut this out along the drawn line all the way around. Once you've cut out your shape, you're going to need to peel off the backing layer of the Bondaweb or double-sided adhesive. This can be difficult to get started, but once you're there, it should be fine, and you're just going to pull it off like so. Now it's time to attach the motif onto your main fabric. You need to position your main fabric with the right side facing up, And you will need to think about the position of your motif. Obviously for this example, I'm just creating a small little square and it's just going in the center of my square. But you may be putting these on to decorate a skirt or a bag or put someone's name on a towel. So it really depends on the placement. And if you've got more than one piece of motif, I would recommend laying them all on together and deciding on the placement before you iron them together. You're going to lay your motifs on with the fabric side facing up, and the Bondaweb slightly tacky side is going to be facing down onto the right side of your fabric. So both layers of fabric, the main fabric and the motif, are facing up. Once you've decided on the placement of your motif or motifs, you're going to iron the layers together, and this you will need heat and steam. Make sure that you iron them for about 10 seconds or until they're really bonded together. Again, I would check your instructions if you are working with a slightly different double-sided adhesive. And if your fabric is sensitive to heat, I would recommend covering it with a pressing cloth. Once you're happy that your motif has stuck with the Bondaweb, you shouldn't be able to pick it off at the sides. You're ready to then either leave it as it is, or complete either a hand stitch or a machine stitch to give it a little bit more detail and security. There are many things that you can do. You can do a simple running stitch by hand, or you can do a fancy stitch by hand using some embroidery techniques around your motif. A stitch that we often like to do is what's called the back stitch, and we have a separate tutorial where we will show you how to do this. We'll pop a link to that in the description box below. But for this tutorial, I wanted to show you how to do it on the sewing machine and do 3 different options that you could potentially use. One is a standard straight stitch, one is a zigzag stitch, and another is a satin stitch. So join me at the sewing machine. We're going to show you all 3 of these techniques. One thing to think about here is that you can really have a play with the thread that you use for this. You don't have to use a normal thread. You can mix up the colour, you can use an embroidery style thread or a metallic thread. It's really up to you. So let's go to the machine. The first technique is to simply sew an edge stitch around the motif. Now we're going to be sewing this with a standard stitch and a stitch length of 2.5 millimeters. However, you're welcome to change that and make a shorter stitch length or a longer stitch length, depending on the look that you wish to achieve. If you're working with a thicker fabric, I would recommend stitching with a longer stitch length for a better finish. Now we're going to be sewing an edge stitch distance, which is 1/8 of an inch, 3 millimeters away from the edge of the motif. And I wouldn't recommend going backwards and forwards. You don't want to have an ugly bit of bulky stitching there. So we're going to sew all the way around and then try and pull our threads through to the wrong side afterwards. Now you're going to need to guide this around. I'm working with a curve, obviously, so I'm gradually moving my fabric around so that I'm consistently stitching 1/8, 3 millimeters away. And I'm using a little nook on my foot as a guide for this. When I get to the point here, I'm going to finish with my needle down, and I'm going to lift up my foot and I'll be turning my fabric. Now you can see that I haven't gone quite far enough, so I'm going to go back and I'm going to use the hand wheel to walk 1 stitch forwards. Then again, my needle's down, I lift the foot, and I will turn the corner. And that's the best way to turn the corner. And you can really be quite accurate if you use the hand wheel. I'm going to complete this all of the way around the motif and try and join up as close as possible to the original stitching. Now I'm going to try and join up with the original stitching. When you're working with a corner, you're more than welcome to again put the needle down and lift the foot slightly if you need help with the turning. And I think I've got 1 stitch here, maybe another one more. Perfect. And I have joined up with the original stitching. I'm now going to take this out of the machine and I'll show you how to finish it neatly from the back. Now this is the wrong side of my fabric. I'm simply going to take a pin and I'm going to try and loop through so that I can pull on the threads to bring through the threads from the front side. So I've got one set here, there's another little loop just there that I need to grab to bring through the other one. There we go. So now I should have 4 threads at the back, 2 from the beginning or the start of the stitching and 2 from the end of the stitching. And I'm going to simply tie them together, ideally in their pairs. So the 2 that started can be tied together in a knot and the 2 that finished. And I'm simply just going to tie it together once and then twice for both of them, and that will just secure everything like so. And then I can cut that off close to the stitching. And now you can see from the wrong side, I have knotted the 2 threads from the start and the 2 threads from the end of the stitching together and cut them off about 1 centimetre, 3/8 away from the knot. Let's look at this from the front side now. Now from the front of the motif you can see the edge stitching, and you can also see that we haven't got any bulk of a backwards and forwards, we've just got a join here, and obviously as I showed you the threads were taken through to the wrong side and neatly tied. Now obviously this standard stitch won't actually stop any of the fraying that you may get, and you can see there's a little bit happening here from the edge of the motif fabric, but it does look nice and it does give a little bit of a finish to the motif that you're attaching, and obviously it will hold it in place. Let's next look at a standard zigzag. Another option to attach the motif to the fabric is to complete a standard zigzag stitch, and you can see the stitch here. Now I've set up the machine to do a standard zigzag stitch with a length of 1 mm and a width of 3 mm. Now I would recommend that you test this so that you are happy with the width and the length of the stitch, and do so before you actually sew this onto your motif. As before, we didn't backstitch to start. We're going to be pulling the threads through to the back of the fabric as we did previously. Now I'm sewing this on the machine so that the zigzag is jumping from the motif onto the main fabric. And ideally I want the edge of the motif to be in the centre of the zigzag. So I'm lining that up with the centre of my foot. Now as you reach a curve, you may find that you need to position the needle into the fabric and slightly lift the foot to move the fabric slightly. This stitch not only looks nice, but you will also find that it may help with a little bit of fraying. And I'm going to continue this all the way back to where I started. Again, not fastening the stitch with a backwards and forwards, because I'm going to thread my threads through from the right side to the wrong side to make sure that everything is nice and neat. That's the same technique that we used for the straight stitch. The final stitch that I'm going to share with you is what is often referred to as a satin stitch. Now the satin stitch is a simple 2-step zigzag, but the length of the stitch is very, very short, so the stitches end up stitching very, very close together, and it creates a really neat block finish that looks really professional. So you'll need to set your sewing machine to a standard 2-step zigzag, and the length of this stitch is what is really important. Now I'm working with a length of 0.25 to 0.5 millimeters. And I would really recommend testing this. You want to choose a length that is really, really close together, that your machine will stitch. If you go too close to 0 millimeters, you'll find that your machine will just stitch back and forwards on top of itself and create a nasty lump, and it won't be able to pull the fabric through the sewing machine. So please test it and work out the minimum length that you can have so that your fabric moves through the sewing machine and doesn't get stuck, but that looks really professional. Now, with regard to the width of the stitch, I'm working with 2mm, but you're welcome to decide on what you would like to work with. This will depend on the fabric that you're using and potentially the motif. If you're working with a fabric that frays a lot or that's very thick, you might want to work with a wider stitch length. Again, I would test this out on the fabrics that you're working with, and you can see what would work best for you. Now, this stitch is fabulous at stopping any fraying because it's really going over the edge of the motif and attaching it to the exterior fabric. It's relatively slow to go through the sewing machine because the machine has to stitch lots and lots of stitches. You will also find that you have to gradually turn the corners and again, I'm trying to keep the edge of the motif in the middle so that the needle is actually picking up the motif and the exterior fabric. So I'm gradually turning the corner. Again, I did not backstitch when I started. I will simply just go over myself ever so slightly when I get back to the start, and then again you can pull the threads through if you wish. Because the stitch is very, very close together, it will stay very, very neat anyway. If you're working with a sharp corner, you may find that you need to put the needle down and lift up the presser foot again, but it will depend on what you're working with. I'm going to let you continue doing this and join me back here when you have finished. And here we have the 3 different stitches that we completed in this tutorial. The straight stitch, the zigzag stitch, and the satin stitch. Now, the satin stitch you may find is already a setting on your sewing machine. If not, you will need to follow the zigzag settings that I explained. Now, to fasten all of these threads, I took them through to the wrong side and tied them off as we completed with the first option. Now, I would recommend having a play here. Decide on the thread that you want to use. Obviously, you don't need to use a corresponding thread. I've used a thread that really stood out so that you could see this, but you could use something decorative such as an embroidery thread or a metallic thread, and it's really up to you. Another thing to think about is interfacing. I would personally recommend interfacing your main fabric before you actually attach the motif and complete any sewing. This will just make sure that it all stays together better, and it will help support the main fabric. You want to choose an interfacing that is a similar weight to your fabric. And you want to iron this on and follow the instructions for the length of time that is required to make sure that it's fully bonded to your fabric. One thing to think about here is that if you're just adding a motif to, say, a skirt or something and it's in a small area, I would recommend actually cutting an oval or a circle of interfacing rather than a square. This will stop the corners from peeling up after time. I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial, and I hope you've learned something new. Thanks for watching.